here's what I'd like to do. I have violated all rules that I would share with colleagues about PowerPoint presentations, because if you have the handout, you notice there are 54 slides with this. I am not going to proceed through 54 slides. This is a resource tool for you, and particularly as we go through this, I'll show you how and why we've organized some things some ways. What I'm interested in covering is certain ground today with a bias towards how do we think about substance and how do we think about organizational dynamics of building a program. So, this is how the slides are organized. Slides 4 to 21 give you a lot of background history on how the field of peace studies was built, with a particular emphasis on the growth of it around the question, what causes war, and an emphasis that our roots lie deep, particularly in Europe. Because European centers developed first in the late 40s, early 50s, followed by the development of American centers. The European closeness of research to action and teaching is different culturally than what we have in the American academy, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage, as we'll talk about with regard to peace studies. So I'm not going to go over those very much at all. We're going to spend more of our time on the last three sets. That is, why is peace studies sort of degraded as not a valid field? How do we what's the nature of those arguments we face in the wider society and maybe even in our campus? And those are arguments that we have to answer. What about the parameters of the field and how does one decide that? And then the logistics of what we think we know for how to build outstanding programs. Let me start with this claim. Others may see it slightly differently, but I think this claim makes sense. Peace studies is an interdisciplinary field primarily, but not exclusively, especially given the backgrounds of many of you in the humanities and the arts, etc., in the social sciences. It may be interestingly distinctive in that it consciously blends, that is, the peace studies field blends research, action, and teaching. Education, action, and research tend to be more merged as a self-identifier than in some other fields. Now, as I said, the next series of slides go through in a variety of ways the history of this. I'm happy under other conditions to explore this more with people. What this is supposed to do is to equip you with arguments and a little bit of background for colleagues elsewhere, particularly on your own campus, who ask the question, hey, wait a minute, I've never heard of one of these before. Does this exist? If existence is defined in part by journals in the field, by other programs, by research centers, by trends, all of that is here, and it's documented for you. So too is some documentation about peace action and the groups involved in peace action. One thing about peace education and more formal peace education. Primary and secondary education methodologies and concepts and approaches to peace education are deeply embedded in schools of education in the US. One of our first groups 2 years ago was the School of Education at the University of Toledo, which came here consciously to build a creative unit for peace education within their Master of Arts in Teaching and to build a research and learning track within their PhD program, just recently approved in March. So they're offering a major component of this for people who get PhDs in education. If you're particularly from an urban environment, one of the things you find is that there's an awful lot of struggle in secondary, in some cases in middle school environments, with violence in schools. Violence in schools has led to programs of peer mediation, conflict resolution training for teachers and the like, anti-bullying campaigns because of violence against any number of individuals selectively or just generally within a school environment. In terms of the field of education, this is a very, very big area. And they don't have any of the methodological or ideological debates that we may have under other conditions in the university. This is serious stuff for them, as serious as testing, counseling, and other subfields. In the university environments, teacher training in dispute resolution, the preparation of people for fields like some of you have, conflict resolution, master's degrees in conflict resolution, have all been valid for a very, very long time. But one of the things that's important for us to see is that at the collegiate level, beginning with the creation of the program at Manchester College here in the middle of Indiana in 1948, in the United States, we now have somewhere between 85 and 125 colleges and universities with bona fide peace studies programs. And we have 25 to 45 graduate ones. Some offer degrees. The bulk of them do offer MA degrees of various kinds. And some now offer PhD programs. The greatest growth in peace studies programs in the US over the last decade at the community college level. Gateway people, where are you? Yay, welcome. Okay, last year we had 3 groups from community colleges. Community colleges are the fastest growing environment for peace studies. Interesting dynamic. Okay, that's a little bit with a lot behind it of what I'm not going to cover. Now, why with all this growth in history that we didn't talk about but is there, why are people still so suspicious of peace studies? Or why do you have an article like you have in your extranet file called The Peace Racket, especially one that identifies all those suspicious activities of people like Scott Appleby and others? Well, because people out there in the academy would say, we believe that the true history of humanity is about war and violence. To believe in peace, as some of you suspect people out there do, or to believe that the teaching about peace would be central is inaccurate and it's fuzzy-headed. We're keeping the language clean for this purpose. But maybe you've encountered this argument before. Especially in the US Cultural Academy, the cultural milieu of the academy. We don't necessarily like the link between peace education and action. We believe in objectivity in the classroom. We're not there to preach or to teach students how to behave. We're there to present the quality information in our field and to allow people to choose to grow in that as they might. Many of our colleagues and people in the wider culture have bad cultural past experiences and stereotypes, like of people from Colorado, long-haired veggie types who may have had a past of getting in touch with themselves, and worse yet, maybe 60s leftovers. At the university, we fear and sometimes think we have documentation, that we have faculty who stand in front of a classroom and say, peace is the answer, what are the questions? And that's backwards for the way many people approach their work in the academy. We believe that faculty who teach peace or want to help students study peace must be essentially, secretly, or even right up front on their sleeves, pacifists. And that's a dangerous mix of values and facts within the academy. The 1991 pacifist calendar. I expect to have better success with this than I do in a classroom of 19-year-olds. So, what does this mean to you? Time slow. Anybody else want to take a crack at what this might mean? Okay. Be even more focused on what might have happened on January 15th. That's interesting. I had forgotten about that. It wasn't a national holiday then yet, believe it or not. So in this midst of national hand-wringing, which began in late November with Les Aspin's testimony before Congress, facing the tough question, would sanctions extract Saddam Hussein and his troops from Kuwait, or would military force be necessary? The first Bush administration set the deadline: if you're not out of Kuwait by January 15th, military force would be used. And the debate continued through the holiday season here, and depending on which community you were in, churches opened their door. There was major inquiry and discussion in the culture about should one go to war to expel Iraq from Kuwait. One of the many cartoons of the era, which cast doubt on the position that you shouldn't, and one of the most biting was this one. See, because what does it say about those pacifists? They don't understand how the real world works. Quick aside, here at Notre Dame, much like maybe your calendars, we tend to begin that second week of January for the second semester. And this is, of course, 20 years ago. No computers, no things running registration for students. It's sign up with the ditto paper, right? My list I get in December for Intro to Peace Studies is 47 students. I happily go into class, having stayed up all night watching Benjamin Shaw and other people at the bombings and everything that began on that late Monday night, into the first class on Tuesday morning, and 148 students are jamming their way into the class. Funny thing about war, it tends to generate thinking about peace. We'll say more about that a bit during campfire stories, but an interesting time. At the political and even think tank level, as supported by the general culture, media and otherwise, we see the primary need, particularly in American society, not as peace, but as security. Peace is seen increasingly as a luxury or as a particular state which, when the war is over, you can get to as a norm. Sort of like how we rebuilt the world after World War II. One time I had a question from a gentleman in the wider community that said, I hope you guys at least talk about the good wars. Because you're all from the era of the bad wars, you 60s people. I hope you talk about the good wars. It's an interesting reflection of the general culture. Particularly, and this may come as no surprise to many who've been teaching for a while, in a post-9/11 climate, what do we worry about when people talk about serious discussion of peace? They don't know how to deal with the harsh realities of the world, the January 15ths, where force must be used. They wrongly believe that we can protect ourselves nonviolently. They believe that somehow international norms trump national security, when our greatest obligation is to protect ourselves, our family, and those closest to us that we love. They may have even surrendered to Hitler or Osama. They can't supply the answers that really work. They keep talking about process. They think with their heart and not their head. I can see guilt-ridden faces all over the room who fit this category. Thus, looking at the extranet and other things we put on your flash drives, this is why we have the last decade of articles like The Peace Racket, Pacifist Claptrap, which was right after 9/11. I use that the first week of every Intro to Peace Studies course. What's correct and incorrect from your point of view as a beginning peace student about the arguments in this essay? The rise of Campus Watch and Front Page Magazine, various critiques. They've waned over the last 2 or 3 years. Harder to make those critiques now because they're not reinforced by a number of other national trends. But sometimes we simply run into the very good colleague or the campus administrator who worries that, and this is an exact quote from a dean, peace studies is antithetical to the critical teaching and inquiry in the academy. I see heads nodding. That dean has a twin. So, with all of that critique and all of that strong and general cultural pushback against peace studies in the environments that surround us or sometimes among colleagues in the academy itself, what can one legitimately and substantively say about this multidisciplinary field? It's really poignant to have thunder in the background. It really is. Ituno just goes to no end to really make this work. Here's one approach that's undergird a lot, but not all of peace studies programs. Essentially, as a field, we can say we work in three general areas. The first being we examine the causes and conditions which generate and sustain violent conflict. Secondly, we look at the mechanisms, the models, some would say the underlying theories, about the resolution of violent conflict. And today, tomorrow, you'll hear whether or not we're in still a conflict resolution mode or conflict transformation or any number of places in between. But that's the general umbrella category. And the third category is we examine the norms, practices, and institutions for building what we now would call just peace or sustainable peace. Every field has primary schools of thought, big areas that then narrow down to smaller areas. Essentially, most of what's legitimately done in peace studies fits in one of those three general big umbrellas. And some of that's going to be determined by a number of things we'll talk about. So if you want to know where's the intellectual anchor and how I'm going to argue with colleagues, how do I be part of a long-standing tradition, this is where it starts. Can I locate my course, my teaching, my research, the co-curricular activities we're going to design with students within one of these? Within these major themes, within the big themes, it's legitimate to pursue scholarly inquiry, to pursue teaching, volunteer activities, co-curricular experiences, and one might even say advocacy across or within three different levels of analysis. Individual, sort of social group or collective, small or within nations, and then at the larger level of nations in the international system. So it's very, very important to see that there may be on your campus a strong potential linkage between work in criminal justice studies and peace studies, because that deals with individual behavior and it deals with small group and institutional interaction. It may be that there's a strong linkage between foreign study components and cross-cultural learning and peace studies. The combination of these two, the causes, reducing, and norms that is a substantive at the top of the columns and the levels of analysis on the left, can create space within for all sorts of themes that might be considered legitimate themes in peace studies, inquiry, or teaching. And the themes in the cells are limited only by the size of the cells. We could go on in a number of areas, particularly now in some interesting transdisciplinary areas like sociobiology and various other things. This is a chart that's been used in the field for over 20 years, so it may in fact even be a little bit dated. But if you want to locate or begin to locate the substantive concerns that you're trying to ground yourselves in, this is an interesting starting place. We can look at it slightly differently and look at the levels of interaction on the left in this kind of Rubik's Cube and decide that the world has changed enough that we can't distinguish just international by one particular mode. Whoops, I'm sorry. But the international, the third level here on the left, that has to do with nation states. the old causes of war, one state to another. But there's also a global or transnational that may relate to international organizations or transnational violent groups like Al-Qaeda, or Physicians for Social Responsibility, or various other transnational groups, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, that work in the transnational environment. We can think about goals of a program up on the upper right, where a program takes a rationale because we're interested in substantive areas, but we're interested in substantive areas maybe in a kind of normative or research-driven way. We're interested in the minimization of violence, or we're interested in political participation as a research and teaching dynamic. And we may be interested in examining particular strategies. Some of us may be involved in programs that prepare people for straight diplomacy or work at an official level. Others much more in a non-official level and community work for political or social transformation. So there's a two-dimensional way to look at it, as we just did before. There's a three-dimensional way to look at this. And we encourage you to think about your own program development within whatever multidimensional way works for you. Now, if I just took a shot at that cell division, which we just looked at thematically for topics, and I wanted to start to think about which disciplines within the social sciences play a role, this is how I might fill it in. Again, with you having the absolute right to say, wait a minute, I'm an economist, I belong in every cell. Okay? We do value maximizing behavior as economists at the individual level, and we think that's related to causes of violence. And so we want to do economics in that very first upper left-hand cell. Makes sense to me. It's constrained here not so much by our vision as much as the size of the cells in a PowerPoint presentation. And in fact, I'd go further and say one of the greatest growth industries of the last decade in peace studies has been in the humanities. Obviously, philosophy, religious studies, and some other areas, the ethics of violence and how we judge that has long been part of a peace research tradition and peace education tradition. But we could put the same amount in every cell here. All the cells of the humanities can fit. Literature, critical for how a culture processes war and heroism, political participation, the dynamic of how we take ownership for terrible actions that have occurred that we're now trying to process after the fact. A literature of genocide, a literature of trauma, arts. Arts and peace building is a growth industry, both in a practical dynamic and for those who've worked in conflict zones, absolutely critical for looking and understanding not only how cultures express their experience that they've had, especially children in violence, but the way we organize strategic peace building for helping communities emerge from violence and legitimize the expression of that over time. So the humanities play a significant role. Fill in the cells. So too, don't forget other interdisciplinary studies. So we could fill in, I just chose three. Gender studies has an interesting intersection with individual causes of violence. But it could also go in the lowest right-hand cell when one thinks about what? The international community, after centuries and centuries and centuries, finally classified rape as a war crime. Security Council Resolution 1825 in the role of women in international affairs. There's a global dynamic related to women in building new norms and institutions to build a world different than a world of violence that fits in the lower right-hand cell as much as critical inquiry and experience in the upper left-hand one. Labor studies and some others maybe uniquely fit to the middle column in terms of dispute resolution, but maybe not just locked in there. Transnational labor studies, very critical to how we look at rise and falls of economic systems, ecological change, and its relationship to violence. So we really have multiple levels of analysis to do to think about the substantive dynamic of peace studies. There's the traditional disciplines of social science, which historically have been the cornerstones. There's the emergence, sustenance, and creativity and inquiry that comes from the humanities. And yes, much to the dismay of some of our colleagues, then there's studies. The linkage between gender studies and peace studies, environmental studies and peace studies. Look what we learned last night, just what a long bus ride would produce from our colleagues from Regis and Notre, and the linkages between environmental studies and peace studies. All of these are critical areas of inquiry that have a grounding in research and in some cases even in pedagogical literature. What is a gender-sensitive peace pedagogy like? Very interesting articles about that. And sometimes it can speak to the questions why in certain areas, including often at Intro to Peace Studies at Notre Dame, the women outnumber the men in the course 2, 3, or 4 to 1. One of our premier European scholars who goes back and forth 6 months in Europe and 6 months here, John Darby, who you'll hear me quote a couple of times this week, came a couple of falls ago to his advanced level undergraduate ethnic violence course, and there were 19 women enrolled. And as the wise guy Irishman that he is, I said, John, how are you going to deal with this? He said, it's no problem, words out, the handsome guy's teaching. All right, good, thanks, John. It's kind of gender-sensitive comment I want. But, I mean, that's not just the luck of the draw. In some cases, women are more interested in some cases than men on this. So that's the way it works. Look at our own distribution somewhat here. Okay, with all of this as background then, let's address some questions before we hear your questions about how does one build a successful peace studies program. And while I'm going to speak at the programmatic level, I think some of this has implications if you're only here, not only here, but if you're here with the primary purpose of building a course or two. If your goal here is to create a good intro course because 5 years down the road we want to get to a program, or if your goal here is I'm a scholar in this area and I think I can move from Renaissance 13th century art to peace studies, what do we know about how some of this works? Keys to success. Given this background and the cells to be filled in, you have to establish a clear intellectual statement of the parameters of the field. This is the wider field of peace studies. If you're building a plan for your campus, this is the field we're introducing you to. But then, as we said last night, you derive from that general big field of inquiry very quickly your own space. From that large set of questions which encompass the field, here's what we choose to do, and you may even say, and why. And why do you choose to do it? For the same reasons we've done it in traditional disciplines since the dawn of the academy. Does the award-winning philosophy program at the University of Notre Dame, which goes from the undergrad program all the way through stellar PhDs, cover every single area of philosophy known to human beings? No. They have a general definition of philosophy in the field. They become known for particular kinds of subfields of philosophy, and in others, they may not even have one instructor. Does a French department make choices? Does a literature department? Political science departments surely do. We haven't taught state and local government and political science here at Notre Dame for 30 years. It's a required course at Indiana University in this state. They have 17 faculty who teach and research in state and local government. Are they more political science-y than we are? No, they're just different. So the same angle of vision, the same substantive argument, the same decisions that we make traditionally in our fields, we can and should make within the context of interdisciplinary peace studies. You derive then that linkage between your substance and why you exist and why you're imperative to exist at the institution from the mission statement of the college or university. Programs are successful, we've seen in the past, because they choose a sustainable curricular and administrative model. That model varies widely, but it's a model that works for your institution. Does it begin on sweat equity? You bet. This is why it's very, very clear that the core faculty are people with fire in their eyes. They're people like you. I want to do this. I want my teaching to reflect this. I'm hearing this from my students. I want courses that speak to this. I've always had a curiosity about this. I think our institution's ready for this. Or we've already done it for 17 years, but we've gotten stale. We've got to redo it. All of the above fit. And it's real helpful. Not absolutely necessary, but it's awfully helpful. If somebody in your administration or lots of people in the administration and your faculty colleagues get it about what you're trying to do. They get it that it's a reasonably valid area of inquiry. And that tells us something about the slope of the climb that different programs have under different conditions. We'll spare ourselves this. That is, let's randomly look at one mission statement of a university. I won't go to the mission statement of the University of Notre Dame. But if we did, we would find it creates a broad enough umbrella about certain values in the wider world and a linkage of translating, if not an obligation, to translate knowledge to the betterment of the human condition, that you can kind of deductively figure out that peace studies might work. One of the more disappointing consultancies I once did in a city and university that will remain nameless was with a vice president of academic affairs who said to me in that one-on-one meeting where after you do a couple of days with faculty, then you go to the place where the buck stops to talk to the provost or the dean or something, and he says, you know, we're a large urban environment. We're located in a downtown. We go from 7 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night doing teaching to a wide range of people, from people just out of high school to people who are 85 years old and we're wheeled in here in wheelchairs. How can we possibly do peace studies? We have this mega urban mandate. I don't know how we got room for peace studies. And I said, I don't know how you have room for doing that without doing it. Because the large urban multifaceted environment is where people's experience of violence, cross-cultural battles, class conflict all happens. And by the way, if you looked at your nursing program, they consider violence the #1 public health threat. And they've been moving force in your university for how do my students learn about peace. They want nurses to have clinical units dealing with violence, and they want social scientists who can give them more conceptual tools. The definition of self of an institution tells us where we can plug in terms of the creation of a program. It's important to be astute to that, even if the administrator is going to say to you, don't be hitting me over the head with our own institutional mission. Now, very practical dynamics. How do you start? How do you do this? Including how do you do this if you had a peace studies program for the last 20 years. First and most important, do a faculty and course inventory. Who's doing what here already? Sometimes that's done by unleashing a couple of good people through a course catalog. That's not the best way, but it's not a bad way to figure out who's doing what once you've defined the intellectual space and the sort of pedagogical parameters. Surveys to faculty, same response rate as surveys to the general citizenship. Sometimes you have to really go after people. Sometimes you decide our core little group, everybody's going to go to one faculty meeting of a different department during their faculty meeting and say, hey, we want to know who's interested in these themes. We're trying to build a new interesting curricular project. But find out who's doing what, where, and when. One of the best calls I got from a university I'd worked with for a while was, do you know where we're finding a lot of people? These geographers are crazy. We never knew that geography was really into this stuff. Some of our people didn't even know we had geography. And they really didn't like it when the geographers showed up in large number and said, you know, actually, we think we are the Peace Studies program. Aha. Examine other programs. All of us have peer institutions. All of us have institutions to which we aspire to be like. What are other programs that are like us at other institutions doing? What are other programs that may be very dissimilar to us in institutional type, but boy, they express our theme. They want to lead with justice, or they want to lead with urban violence and its dynamic, or whatever. How do we find those? Meet and talk, create an experiment, and evaluate. If we're going to run an Intro to Peace Studies program for the first time, or an interesting urban kind of plunge for the first time in which students are going to encounter class conflict, cross-cultural conflict alike, make sure you evaluate it. People like evidence, especially people in the academy. Okay? Build a student recruitment strategy. Recruitment and retention are critical. And as Joan Fallon will tell us in a couple of days, communicate. And learn how to communicate what you're doing. We'll talk more about that. Now, what's in a name? Maybe you should all be called the Peace Studies program. But that makes it a little dicey with some folks. Some people are interested in justice studies. Peace is the work of justice. There is no peace without justice. So they're really interested in the balance, what they call justice studies. Some people define their intellectual niche and the like as peace and justice studies. Others as justice and peace studies. Some people don't want to use the whole word, so they call it the P&J program or the J&P program. Some people like the acronym sounding POX, as if it were PAX, so they call themselves the Peace and Conflict Studies program. Peace and Global Studies, PAGS. When I was a part of a debate at the Earlham College faculty long, long ago, one dissenting colleague, yes, even at a Quaker college, got up and said, I'd prefer if the name of this program was the GAPS, Global and Peace Studies, because he thought we were full of gaps, not treating war sufficiently hard-nosed enough. Peace and World Order Studies was the dominant theme in the 70s and 80s for many places. Other real names, the School of Justice and Social Inquiry out in Arizona, the Program of Nonviolent Social Change, Syracuse University, Program in the Analysis and Resolution of Conflict, Park. Peace and World Security Studies, the 5-College Consortium up in the Boston area. The Kroc School of Peace Studies, our kissing cousins at the University of San Diego, and the Kroc Institute. Institute, school, studies, program, nonviolent, justice, social inquiry, arose by any other name, it still arose. But names are important because they reflect values, debates, and other kinds of things. Do not choose your name lightly. What defines a field for some of our colleagues? Somebody says, show me the journals and show me the shelves of material on the library. That's partly why we have Doug here, because these things exist. There are seminal works. There are works that are very current and hot and might not be seminal, but all these exist. Which reminds me that in room 103, we have a shelf of interesting books for you to examine as you'd like. If you're just entering the field, you can page through some of those. Two of the most interesting are 2 curriculum guides. One from 1978 from the Peace and World Order Studies program at the Institute for World Order in New York, and another last year published by Reiner Publishers, the 7th edition. The nice thing about the 7th edition of the Peace and World Order Studies curriculum guide is that it's got introductory essays in there about different areas of the field. It's got about 150 syllabi. You want to do that inventory of your faculty, and you say, look, arms race issues, violence, there's got to be a way to get scientists involved, physicists or somebody involved in this. You'll see syllabi in there that are done at other campuses by physicists and the like. And you can go and examine those, Xerox them, send it to your colleague from physics saying, we're looking in our new program for somebody to teach a course like this. Who do you think would do that? The needs of society sometimes define a field. And I will tell you, at large university environments, people professionally in nursing and education are leading the way for legitimizing peace studies because they face it every day. People at School of Nursing, one place I dealt with, said, we can't turn out nurses that are going to make it over the next 25 years unless they understand trauma, trauma healing, causes of violence, and how to sustain themselves. Susan St. Ville is going to talk a little bit about reflexive practice. What do we do in making sure that people who are going to go out and do conflict resolution or learn about it actually can be functional to deal with it afterwards? Because some of this is not pleasant stuff, as you know. Professional schools lead the way. The link between substance, content, and pedagogy is all there. But you've got to take ownership of it yourself in your own environment. Global directories for the Peace and Justice Studies Society in the US, the curriculum directory I just talked about, which is over in the resource room. These things are there. Let me finish up a little bit to talk about, okay, if I was starting from scratch, what would I say is the structure that can hold a program together even in a very small campus environment with limited faculty resources? What's the bare bones? What's also the inner vertebrae structure for a mega program? Almost the same thing. You have to have an intro course. It's not we just adopted the international relations course from political science or the social violence course from sociology and said that'll qualify. There's got to be a distinctive intro to peace studies course, some of which deals with the violence problem, some of which deals with peace and nonviolence. And the faculty person in charge can play to their strengths and decide which they want to emphasize, but it's got to have some of both. We're fortunate here, we have a lot of faculty doing that now, and they all bring different areas of emphasis. But we've already agreed that some of this has got to deal with bad and terrible violence, and some of it deals with how you get to peace. Second thing that good programs have, distinctive mid-range courses that your people do. Some of those that are most dominant in the field, a course on nonviolent social change. This is how Gandhi, King, and these others operated. And of course, the data adds up day by day. This is how they did it in Egypt. This is how they did it in Poland in the late 80s, and on and on. Conflict resolution, unique to peace studies. People want to be trained as intro negotiators and mediators. The experience of just generally peace and war. Now that can be problems of peace and war in history, problems of peace and war in economics, problems of peace and war in literature, or in film studies, or in gender studies. But it's something that's a unique contribution that your group can do. Maybe it's experimental for a while and transdisciplinary with another transdisciplinary program. Two faculty, again, with fire in their eyes, one from environmental studies and one from peace studies, who, yes, often as an overload say, we're going to work together. And the best way to work together is let's teach a course, let's put some students in a room and see where this goes, as we all read some of the literature and struggle with current policy things. We don't know where it'll go, but let's try it once. How do you do service learning? 2 decades ago, in addition to defending peace studies as a legitimate enterprise, many of us in an institutional context had to defend service learning. The critique there was, of course, sure, let people go out and experience life and let's throw credits at them and then give them a degree, right? But now service learning has a huge pedagogical literature behind it. It's the key to community town-gown relations for many people. In this town, I will tell you the number of volunteer hours that Notre Dame students give to everything from the Center of the Homeless to a variety of other projects sustains part of this town. But it's also critical to us in how we think we help our students mature, develop, and stay honest about what we do in the classroom versus their experience. We have an entire center devoted to some of this, okay? As do many of you. And then finally, a good component is what do we do with seniors? Sometimes it's just, well, you know, we've got 4 seniors, everybody does an independent study, capstone experience, work with a couple of faculty. Let's bring closure to this. I think we have to bring closure to with students who are at the undergraduate level. Have to give them a chance to put it all together. Then when you get the numbers, then you can think about a senior exit course or a senior seminar or the like. But don't forget to think about the seniors. Last couple of things. Okay, we have a hearing from the dean. Some of our faculty colleagues are a little nervous, but they're willing to go ahead, but they're still worried about this. We have an agenda question, that we're mixing facts and values, that we're there to preach to students. We have to make an argument. The argument is, I think folks in nutrition studies don't say to students, look, you want to smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day and have half a bottle of scotch and raw eggs? It's not going to affect you. It's fine. But if you'd like oatmeal, carrots, and a lot of water, same thing. Nobody I know in nutrition studies is value neutral about those 2 different forms of human behavior. One is really bad for you, and it will lead to self-destruction. The other is likely to sustain you for a longer time. It's okay to say that peace is probably better than war. It's harder to historically validate that given the trends in some of our fields. But it's not hard to validate that in terms of human experience. And it's certainly valid to talk about that as a contended point of view within the classroom. So we're no less value-driven than folks in theater arts who have a passion for Shakespeare, accounting who believe that people ought to do honest accounting of their income and outgo, engineering who believe that buildings ought to stand straight and stable, maybe even during hurricanes and earthquakes. None of those fields are value neutral. Why does peace studies have to be value neutral? We all entered our fields, and maybe even we entered education on the notion that education is one of the great social change agents of our society. It improves the prospects for individual happiness and for the betterment of the general community. And if we have administrators who say it's not about that, then we all have a problem, not just in peace studies. It can and should be goal-oriented. It may, in fact, have a different kind of pedagogy. We talk about that down the line. But I think we can defend ourselves on these grounds. Keys to campus success, you can look at that and see how that works for you. The last item is most important to me, the last 2. We do what we do with transparency. The best people to have in a room at the initial stages of debating the program are the key distractors. The key detractors. In the 1970s, in the development of the Peace Studies program at Earlham, which I was privileged to be a part of, we had 2 key faculty who were survivors of the Holocaust. They were very skeptical of this. We invited them, please, teach a course in the Holocaust. How can we have a credible peace studies program in the 1970s without a serious discussion of the Holocaust? It turned them right around to be supporters of the program. Every one of us are going to have this kind of opportunity. Be transparent and open, invite the detractors, do a little conflict resolution within your own small framework. Hear other people out. Don't be defensive, be comparative. What led other studies programs in our environment to be successful? What led others to go down the tubes? And on and on. And I don't think you have to be embarrassed to make the claim that the better world needs this better kind of program. Final points. I'll say more about this as the week goes on, but this is widely cited as the life cycle of violent conflict and its resolution. It comes out of work of the United States Institute of Peace. Very important to identify areas of the field in this. We at Kroc would say our identified area of the field right now is right here. we do a lot more in post-conflict peace building than we do in looking at the movement from stable peace to crisis escalation and the outbreak of violence. We have some people doing excellent stuff on the outbreak of violence in certain areas, but this is our raison d'etre. That's the Strategies of Peace book and a lot of things like that for the bulk of us. When I look at this, something really interesting has happened in my 35 years in the classroom. And that is, when I started way back when, as many of you did, the interesting part about this was you'd enter a classroom and say, okay, I'm trying to train the general citizenry to worry about war and see it's a bad thing. And maybe somebody out there might someday become the assistant to the assistant to the assistant secretary of state, and they'll be in a place of policy influence. Maybe I'll be training somebody who can help us get to a ceasefire, one of the thousands of people. Then the world changes. Nature of violence changes in the 80s and 90s. The problem of rebuilding societies in deep-seated conflict and how long that takes changes, or our consciousness about it changes. And all of a sudden we get to a point here where what do you need for building peace? Not just the assistant to the assistant secretary of state, the smartest kid in the class. I need those people who are going to be nurses and doctors so that when they become that successfully in this culture, they might think about becoming part of Doctors Without Borders. I need police officers who are successful enough within their American environment to understand that we operate according to the rule of law and people are innocent till presumed guilty, that we can take a month out of their time if they'd like and send them to Bosnia or somewhere else to help train people in just policing in an emerging democratic society. I need people who are going to be legal specialists, lawyers, and accountants, and nurses who see their professional life having a global linkage and a global role connected to others who are emerging from violence. I need educators in primary education who can help societies rewrite their 7th grade textbooks, which have been loaded for 3 decades with these terrible stereotypes which reinforced violence incredibly in that culture. In other words, the difference between way back when in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s and now is that peace studies as an enterprise, like many other of our discipline enterprises, was kind of, let us teach you the dynamics of the field, and hopefully a select few of you will go on to areas of prominence in this and make a difference and bring peace in the world. We now are in the peace building of the larger community and of the every person. The capacity of so many of our students in their professional and personal lives to be part of post-conflict peace building means that we have an urgency in the field to educate more and more and more people who can build more and more linkages to the solution rather than observe the problems in the solution as spectators on the nightly news. And I know that many of you in your different communities understand this, especially our good colleagues from Cartagena and elsewhere. Let me stop there with one final note. What's the ultimate quest of peace studies? Isaiah's peaceable kingdom. But, giving you my own impressions, Woody Allen may have been correct. The lamb and the lion may in fact lie together, but the lamb won't get much sleep. Let's stop there and take some questions and answers and other things like this. The floor is open. Yes, please, Claire.
As I listen to you, I'm wondering what the definition of peace is. Is it the absence of war or disposition to peace building with respect to peace studies?
Very good question. I'm going to turn it over to 4 colleagues to know. I'll answer that. I'll take my own crack at this, and anybody in the room is welcome to do that. Our working definition of peace is that peace is a condition which is intentionally built by parties that have been both victims and perpetrators of violence, and is a set of processes and conditions which can lead to violence not being the way in the future for settling disputes. I don't think you need to have a definition of peace that assumes there's been violence. But I think you have to have a definition of peace that has as a strong component a recognition of the movement towards potential violence by contending parties. So we're building norms, institutions, processes that keep us in a condition of not fighting out our disputes with violence. Yes?
George, at the beginning you had like the 3 categories, causes of war and all of that stuff. And when you go for a case study, we might differ as to what the causes are.
Yeah.
So is that kind of included in this model?
Yeah. A perfect inclusion might be, for example, an economist who believes that it's all about resources and resource management, and in some cases the maximization of one's individual rights to gain, and so therefore maybe even greed causes violence. And a social psychologist who would say, I think people hate each other because they have reason to hate each other in terms of their cultural and historical background. So you have there what we often call the greed versus grievance debate. You can have separate courses in that. You can have those as different sections of your intro course. You might even be lucky enough to put those 2 contending views in the same room with students. The people who say, you want peace? Organize the economy the right way, both internally within societies and globally. The other person says, no, you want peace? People need to learn how to be free of their stereotypes of the other. They need adequate ways of socio-communication. They need tolerance. They need values. And then when they have that, they can get to the economy.
But that's problematic when you're creating a program, because
Yep.
not everybody agrees, then you obviously have a problem.
It depends on whether or not you think in your program development cycle, you have to have all the answers on that. Or you want part of the program development cycle to be the essentially contested dialogue there. Wellesley College in Massachusetts has had a peace studies program for a long time, but the last couple of years it's been engaged in a sort of re-examination of it. One of their more interesting dialogues in the faculty is they have, for a variety of historical reasons, lots of contact with the subcontinent, India especially, but India and Pakistan. They have world-renowned faculty in Indian studies. One of the most prominent faculty said, I don't know why these people in peace teach so much about Gandhi. Nobody in India has talked about Gandhi for 20 years. Gandhi didn't lead to partition. Gandhi didn't lead to independence. Here's what led to independence against the British. And here you have this committed pacifist philosopher who's one of the mainstays of the peace studies program, thinking that Gandhi set the way for modern understanding of social transformation without violence. He moved an entire subcontinent. Well, for a long while, these 2 guys were on 2 opposite sides of the campus. Not only geographically, but even further apart substantively and conceptually. They ran a senior seminar together. Students said, I came out absolutely schizophrenic. But I suspect after graduation they recovered and will see it as a good learning experience. Now, where those people are going to be in 2 or 3 years, they're still in dialogue. Let's see. I think it's difficult to integrate the absolute detractors. Okay, let's not kid ourselves about that. Somebody who says, I believe this program is dangerous to the university, it's going to cost us donors. They're going to have to work that out some way. Sometimes it's useful to try to appeal to higher authority. This is where a dean or a department chair has given you some blessing to create the program is helpful. There's nothing in this model, I hope, that leads you to think that everybody you're going to encounter can somehow be converted or be nice. That's not anybody's experience.
Back to the definition of peace. Do you think you have to make the link to physical violence to include structural violence as something that should legitimately be studied in peace studies?
I think that's what the field has done for many decades, and that's quite important to do. Different programs will do that with a different area of emphasis. It's always more difficult to convince sometimes our colleagues about structural violence being a matter of concern, because it often lends them to say, sure, any bad thing that goes on in the world is the subject of peace now, right? So you got to have an answer to that. And often in the academy, our colleagues want the answer to be more analytical and more narrow, more focused.
Yeah, that makes me think of the definition of peace that you get in Catholic social teaching. It's really, really, I love it, but it is really, really broad. It's peace is not just the absence of war, but the positive realization of the dignity of the whole human family.
Yeah.
So it can't get much broader than that, but I still like it.
So you've got to figure out a way, being at a Catholic institution, with that as the guiding rubric, you derive from that a modus vivendi, a way of doing things, and a way to encapsulate that which is workable, in which you're not offering courses bettering the human condition 101, which, sets up the lines of attack from various colleagues, or is seen as, given all the things we've got to do, where's this, it's not just about making students feel good, or Catholic institutions make them feel guilty. Yes?
I'm interested in how you cast yourself as a peace studies program, in part because I found it interesting that you used you used professional programs as models of disciplines that are that have a real value system and something they're trying to accomplish. Given that the social prestige of a professional program tends to be lower in academia than social sciences, say, is it valid to say, yeah, we're a professional program? Criminology, turns out people whose aim it is to lower crime, we think crime, or at least violent crime, is a bad thing. We're a peace studies program, we try to make peace builders, so call us a professional program, because we draw from different social sciences, we find tools that work for this aim, or is that too dangerous at a place like this, and maybe drawing the criticism that you got from the dean?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. Thank you. The utilitarian response is do what works for you in your environment. If we're at the University of Chicago, where applied programs are not going to be looked on well and not the norm, what you do is you do something like create the Committee on Social Thought, when you say, we believe the most interesting cutting-edge questions in the disciplines are the points at which the disciplines merge. Therefore, we're trying to create a collection of faculty and courses that look at these pressing areas, and our most difficult examples are the ones that are contemporary in the society, about violence and peace and the like. And so we're going to invite sociologists and political scientists and ethicists and sociobiologists to join us in this committee. If you're at an institution which has decided, if we just stay disciplines, we're going down the tubes. It's about enrollment. It's about people feeling there's a sense of whether or not there's a job out there. Do we address the things that are going on in our community in a more practical way? Then you probably have the space to move in which you can look a lot more applied. But you can do it either way. And I don't want anything I've sketched here to undercut the notion that one of peace studies' great vitalities as a research and teaching field is that it does hit those cutting edges of where the best thinking in some of the social science disciplines are going, and where they feel the need to interact with the others, and with humanities, and again, finally, with ethics, in ways that bring together philosophers, people in religious studies, with social scientists and humanists. Am I adequately answering that? Okay. Yes?
I would like to say that I do think our conceptions of peace deserves a really deep and intimate conversation.
Among us here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I feel that, well, I'd like to offer that.
Good.
And then the second thing is, to the second person who commented about disagreements or putting together a team and a program and coming to some sort of consensus. You know, that is that process that we talk about. And if there's one thing that I feel has been so important in my life in doing and in focusing on the work that I've been doing for the last 12 years, is that I'm so very much more comfortable with conflict than I was before. And that, I think, is truly what we're all about, is bringing that balance to meeting conflict and talking it out and not being disturbed by the fact that we don't agree. Because it's not natural to agree. We all think differently, and it's very important that everyone be comfortable. And I think that's such a very basic, I can't even call it disciplinary, but that's a great gift of the work, and we can use that so much to our advantage.
Jane, thank you. I particularly want to underscore that dynamic. I think it's important to help colleagues sometimes learn by our example of that comfort zone, and we're willing to dig in for the long while to hear others and detractors' opinions as part of building a program, as opposed to building essentially this big bulldozer that's going to drive its way through some faculty committee with people screaming and shouting against it, but by gosh, we're going to outvote them. I think that's very, very important, to be consensus building in ways that you can. On your other, we'll find time to do that. I don't necessarily want to avoid that issue. I think the notion of what people's own working definition of peace is will tell us a lot, because we've got such good diversity in this room, people's backgrounds and things. So I promise you we'll find a way to play with that soon.
Yeah, could you, I noticed that at Notre we have attracted more veterans into peace studies.
Yeah.
Could you speak to the, just how that's shaping up around the country with veterans coming into peace studies programs, and what we need to be thinking about in order to both draw on their knowledge and wisdom as well as questions to think about.
Yeah, and this is a query that others can and should comment on. I don't know what the experience is in Connecticut at Gateway about what you're seeing about returning veterans. This is one of those areas where I think community colleges may be at the cutting edge. What do we have? We don't have a GI Bill of Rights and various other kinds of things in a GI program that is reintegrating soldiers back into society the way we've had in the past. The paths demographically are much more lumpy. Some people went in, thought they were promised a college education when they came out, and find out they didn't do this, this, and this. We know the wider society has every now and then an interesting story in the paper, but the full demographic mix of this is absolutely under the radar screen. Okay? 1 out of every 7 police officers in the state of Indiana was a reservist or guard person called back to duty, for example, within the last 10 years. And 90% of them have been judged not fit to continue in their work. So what's the impact of that on the state of Indiana, just in terms of law enforcement officers? What's the capacity of our communities to deal with this? We have a nationally renowned Center on the Homeless in town, which does fabulous work, which got a grant from a former veteran to establish a unit to deal with returning people. They did a pretty good community survey of the social service agencies, the churches. What do you think we need? How many people do you think we'll be faced with? They set up an initial unit which was going to have something like, 28, 30 beds for men and 14 for women, etc., and 3 times that number subscribed in the first week. our communities have no sense of what's coming back. We know the stories of domestic violence. We know the dilemma of suicide, very, very high for people coming back. The impact of this on the educational structure, we're absolutely unprepared to deal with. At more formal four-year institutions that enroll 18 to 22-year-olds like Notre Dame, we hardly see this at all, okay? But other places like yourselves, community colleges, places in urban environments going to see it big time. The only things I've seen that have been at the lead on this, institutions which say, look, we've got to be ahead of the demographic curve. We're establishing within student services an office for veterans affairs. We're interacting with people in the community. We want to know, as they integrate back into the educational system, what do they want, what do they need, and quite frankly, we also have to know something about how they're feeling. We have to make sure they understand the rules of the academy. We have to understand a lot of things, and we have to keep our eye on some people to help them re-enter. The notion that the college classroom may be the primary vehicle for people's re-entry after 2 or 3 deployments is a very real possibility. Because after the welcome family picnic, when everything else goes south for the next month, where's the level of re-entry for people? And I don't know whether it's national conferences and student services or counseling or other things, or where the good work is going on here. This is out of our zone here, you know. But I'd encourage you to investigate that, because that's a huge cutting-edge problem, it seems to me. Great question. I think you have a yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to
Please.
jump in on that,
Yeah.
because Lewis, the Catholic school that we're at, we have an ROTC program, and we've just been designated, the university sent out a blurb about it and voted a military-friendly college. And I have to say, as someone who is a hardcore pacifist, I read
Oh, no.
kind of went, but, and I've noticed that there are sort of like more and more veterans and people in the ROTC training programs appearing in my classrooms. And one of the things I want to do is reach out to them in ways that are respectful of their experience and integrate them. And I think, you know, I'm wrestling with the same sort of challenge, right? Like, how do we create space for their voices, but also, I think, educate the entire community about this huge unrecognized problem. And so I'm wondering about things like the value of really doing university-wide education on the Winter Soldier hearings, for instance, that came out of Vietnam and Iraq, and whether that would be helpful, therapeutic.
It'll be lively.
Necessarily controversial.
Yeah, it might be controversial, might be lively, but it's. There's an article in your archive of things by Chad Alger, one of the great thinkers in the field, just turned 80, who says the place of peace studies is to be at the crossroads where nobody else wants to be yet. This is a great example of that. This is the crossroads of violence and war comes home to a culture which likes to welcome home the war hero, but is so ambivalent about what we've been in the last decade and the violent confrontations are sufficiently ambivalent to going on that there's no ticker tape parade.
But
You know,
I think it's not just that the ambivalence about these wars.
Right.
Even if you look at things like World War II,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Once the parades were over,
Right.
everybody went
Right.
off to their own little environments
Right.
and somehow coped.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's very, very important. I'll just share one thing before you go to coffee. You know, all of us are now and then called on to do various things about, can you do a special institute for high school teachers, various things. A couple of years ago, now 4 years ago, one of the people here who does some of that asked me to do a one-day thing for high school teachers during Indiana Teachers' Day at the end of October, dealing with war and peace. You can do that, George, et cetera, et cetera. So I got, you know, the PowerPoints lined up and all the rest of this stuff. 19 teachers in the classroom, most of them from around this area. I've got the schedule real tight, et cetera. And first 5 minutes, go around the room. Who are you? What do you teach? Where are you from? Second one, maybe we should start by talking about our understanding and experience with war. You know, and I had like 20 minutes down there for that, and then I was going to go to the first thing. The first guy I started with, social science teacher for 30 years, and he said, you know, excuse me if I'm personal for a minute. We lost my dad last week, and my sister and I have been up in the attic, and we've gone through trunks and various things, and Dad's diary from being in the Asia Pacific theater that we've never seen before. And we're starting to understand why he was a lifelong alcoholic. And he went and he said some things. Then the next person, young lady, second year, teaching middle school, said, you know, it's sort of interesting. I just married a couple of weeks ago and had this sort of funny experience, you know, since you've been personal. My stepdad and my mom came and said, you know, maybe now's the time to tell you that actually your dad didn't die in Vietnam. He just came back so changed. He left, and that's how Dad and I actually got divorced. And we were divorced. I was not a widow. You probably ought to know that. And you know, 2 days before the great wedding. But we went around the room, and every one of the 19 people had a war story. And only one of them had been actually in the armed forces. 2.5 hours later, there's not a dry eye in the room, including me. The schedule shot to hell. But it was the most moving experience I've had on war peace issues in maybe 30 years. And, you know, what does that tell us about our culture, our society, and the hiddenness, or the mythology of heroism, or any number of things, or our lack of preparedness to deal with this?
And I guess that's the thing, if peace studies is at a crossroads,
Yeah.
then on this particular topic, what do the roads look like? And where are they meeting? What is the crossroads look like? I think
Yeah,
that's something that, you know, I at least now realize
Yeah,
we need to have a lot more conversation about it.
Yeah, no, I'm going to feel particularly weak-kneed about that, because I'm not sure any of us know. I think we may have a comfort zone at the Kroc Institute where we can say where our crossroads are, because we deal with lots of international students, lots of other things, but it's going to be different from anybody else's crossroads. And I'm really glad that John Paul's doing tomorrow and going to provide all these answers.
Oh, good.
For now, you're on coffee break until 10:45. Thank you very much.